Today, it's gonna be all about chiffon cake. So I made a tutorial a while ago, about like 3 years ago. Since then, I changed the way of making it slightly. Also, the amount of ingredients are slightly different. So I thought it would be a perfect time to make an updated version. In the past, I got so many questions about chiffon cake, including all the issues they've got, such as why didn't it rise so much? Can I use all-purpose flour? Why don't you add baking powder? Or why did it deflate? So today I'm gonna answer all of that to clear out your questions. And after watching this video, I hope you feel confident of making it, even if this is your first time. Okay, so let's talk about the pan first. For chiffon cake pan, do not use a non-stick pan because the side of the cake slides down and the cake deflates as it cools down at room temperature. That is why a lot of the chiffon cake is made with aluminum, which stick to the cake pretty well. First, in the bowl, add yolks and vanilla. Set aside the egg whites to make meringue later. Today I'm going to use vanilla beans, but of course you can use vanilla extract instead. But do not add it too much because whenever I added it a little bit too much, the texture of the cake gets a little bit more rough and the cake doesn't rise as much as it should. You can also omit vanilla or use a different flavor as well. And add sugar and whip. So whipping the yolks here is totally optional. By whipping it, it contains more airs inside, which helps the cake to rise a little bit more in the oven, but the difference is very minor. So that is why you could omit it to make the process a little bit easier if you want to avoid a little bit of hassle. Oh, okay. Add water and oil. Oh, today I'm going to use olive oil. You can use other types of oil like canola oil or vegetable oil also. The water and oil helps to create a very moist cake. And mix. Mix roughly. And add sifted cake flour. Mix really well until smooth. Scrape off the sides to catch all the dried flours. So right now, as you can see, it looks pretty lumpy because of the cake flour. And do not stop it here yet because we do not want any lumps of cake flour in your finished cake. Now you can see it's very smooth. It almost looks like a loose pastry cream. All right. Looking good. Next, let's work on the meringue. And this is probably the most important part of making chiffon cake. It's very important to make very stiff meringue because the meringue does the main job to let the cake rise in the oven and ensure that all the tools like stand mixer, everything is free of oil, liquids, or any residue. When you separate eggs, ensure that yolks are not going in the egg whites because they contain the natural oil which prevent the egg whites from whipping really well. Add about half of the sugar when the meringue is whipped up like hand soap. And add the remaining sugar when the meringue is whipped up like fluffy shampoo. And continue whipping it until it gets very fluffy and stiff. This is still too soft, so let's keep going. Okay, now let's check. The tip should stand straight when lifting the whisk like this. Add about half of the meringue to the yolk mixture and quickly start folding it. When folding it with the whisk, repeat the motion, scoop and toss. Scoop and toss adds turning a ball. You don't have to blend them completely, just stop when it's roughly mixed like this. The meringue slowly starts separating as it sits. I recommend re-whipping it if you think you left it a little bit too long. Scoop all the meringue out as soon as possible. Okay, and then fold again. And again, continue folding it with the whisk, with the scoop and toss motion. Stop folding when it's roughly mixed and when you don't see any lumps of meringue. And at the very end, switch to a spatula and clean up the bottom and side of the bowl. Stop folding as soon as it is evenly incorporated. Okay, looking good. Pour it into the pan. Try not to spend too much time here because the air bubbles in the meringue slowly pop and disappear as it sits for longer time. And in the very end, swirl the cake batter with a toothpick or chopstick or something like that. This helps to eliminate big air bubbles in the cake batter. Alright, so let's put it in the preheated oven. Bake at 340 Fahrenheit for about 40 minutes. But this really depends on the oven and the size of the pan. So adjust the baking time accordingly. When the cake is done, the top of the cake should bounce back gently when you touch it, or the toothpick should come out clean when inserting it in the middle. Flip the cake upside down as soon as it is out of the oven. It helps the cake a little bit to hold its height. And let it cool completely. To remove the cake out of the chiffon cake pan, I used to insert a spatula along the side like this. But with this way, the surface of the cake got hurt, got scratched oftentimes. So now I take it up with the hands. Just push the side like this. And do the same with the center. Flip the pan and push to take out the side of the pan. And push the side of the cake like this to detach it from the bottom of the pan, and twist and lift to take it out. You don't have to worry about the cake getting squished by doing this way because chiffon cake is very soft yet very bouncy. And now it is basically done. You can decorate the top with powdered sugar or fruits, or floss the surface with whipped cream to make a birthday cake or make it look a little bit fancy. Today I'm just gonna slice it and plate it with whipped cream and some fruits. For me, whipped cream is a must for chiffon cake. They taste perfect together. If you haven't tried my chiffon cake recipe yet, I hope you give it a try. It is super fluffy, light, and moist. I think you're gonna love it if you love a fluffy dessert like me. Alright, so I wanted to show you how the cake turns out when using a non-stick pan or a glazed chiffon cake pan. As you can see, the cake rises really well in the oven, but it shrinks as it cools down. And it doesn't look like it shrunk a lot because the top of the cake is hanged on the top edges of the pan, but you can clearly see that the cake shrunk after taking out the pan. And in the past, I got so many questions about why don't you add baking powder? You can add baking powder if you want to. For certain recipes, the cake might rise more when adding baking powder. But with this recipe specifically, because we are adding the minimum amount of flour to make the most fluffy chiffon cake, even though you add baking powder and cake rises a lot in the oven, it actually shrinks as it cools down. And also without baking powder, this chiffon cake is extremely fluffy, so I never feel a need to add it. But again, it might be effective for some recipes. And I also got so many questions about if you can use all-purpose flour instead of cake flour. And the answer is yes. With all-purpose flour, the cake rises well, as you can see, but with cake flour, the cake feels a little bit more lighter and fluffier. But I have to say the difference is not huge. The cake still feels fluffy with all-purpose flour. So if you cannot find cake flour, I would say go ahead and use all-purpose flour. And I almost forgot about mentioning how to store the cake. Wrap the surface tightly so that it's not gonna get dried, and you can store it at room temperature in the fridge or freezer. When the cake did not rise, there are a couple reasons you can think of, and the biggest one is meringue. Maybe the meringue was not fluffy enough. Maybe it was a little bit too soft. So make sure to whip it up until it gets very fluffy and stiff. Or maybe something went in the egg whites, such as oil and liquids, and egg whites did not whip properly. So always use clean tools and ingredients. Or maybe the meringue was made perfectly, but you waited a little bit too long. It took a little bit too long to fold the meringue, which eliminated a lot more air bubbles in the meringue. So be always mindful to move quickly as soon as the meringue is made. And when the cake deflated a lot after taking it out from the oven, most likely the cake was under baked. So try baking it a little bit longer time next time. Or it also happens when you did not use a proper pan. Like I mentioned earlier, do not use a non-stick pan and always use a proper chiffon cake pan. And I also want to let you know that it's totally normal that the cake deflate a little bit because this cake is so fluffy, but it shouldn't deflate drastically. With this recipe, the cake should feel very moist. It must be over baked when it feels dry. And when you see lumps of meringue in the finished cake, maybe the meringue was a little bit too stiff, or you waited a little bit too long before using it and the meringue got separated. So like I said earlier, try using it right away. If you waited too long somehow, always whip it again. It's not gonna go back the same when you waited too long, but it's so much better than not doing it at all. Or maybe you folded the ingredients with spatula instead of a whisk, because the meringue is pretty fluffy and the yolk mixture is pretty loose. It's gonna be so much easier to combine the two with a whisk without leaving the lumps of meringue. So in the past, I got questions about what's the difference between chiffon cake and angel food cake, and also what's the difference between chiffon cake and other types of sponge cake. So I thought I'm going to include that info here. This is solely my opinion, so some people might say a little bit different things. So for me, the sponge cake refers to any cake that's made with whipped eggs to create the fluffy texture. And under the umbrella, there are so many types of sponge cakes, including chiffon cake, Genoise sponge cake, biscuit sponge cake, Chiffon sponge cake, angel food cake. And I probably missed something right here, but those are some of the most popular sponge cakes. And each sponge cake has different characteristics, different way of making it. Genoise sponge cake is made by whipping whole eggs and adding flour later, while biscuit sponge cake is made by whipping egg whites and adding yolks and flour to it. Depending on the recipe, you whip yolks or not, just like chiffon cake. And oftentimes you add butter or liquid such as milk to make it more moist. And chiffon cake is made by mixing yolks, oil, water, and flour and adding meringue to it. And the method of angel food cake is very similar to biscuit sponge cake. We just don't add yolks to it. And oftentimes fat and liquids are not added either. And Chiffon sponge cake is basically almond sponge cake. So we normally beat eggs, powdered sugar, and almond flour and add meringue to it. So these are the basic ingredients, but you can also add additional ingredients such as flavoring and salt. That's it for today. If you think the video was helpful, please let me know. And if you love fluffy cake like this one, please check out my other fluffy sponge cake recipes. They are all so delicious. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy pastry living, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.